Hello, Matt Galway. Welcome to the show. How's it going, mate?
Great. Thank you so much for having me on, Love.
Absolute pleasure. So good to hear that. And so glad you are here because I've been reading your work recently and I thought we might be able to have an interesting chat about two of these really big parts of the Khmer Rouge story, which is the influence from the so-called Paris educated intellectuals, or I'll be more specific, three of these intellectuals, whom listeners will recall I've referred to over the course of numerous episodes: Hou Yuon, Khieu Samphan, and Hou Nim, the so-called three ghosts. So I'm interested in what you can share with listeners about them, but you've also got this expertise in Maoism generally, and I thought it'd be great to have you on and just dig into both of these topics, these influences, how they impacted the ideology of the Khmer Rouge. So that's kind of what we've got in store. And I do have some questions here, but I'm also thinking we're probably just going to meander through this anyway. So, Matt, enough from me. Why don't you just kick us off with a little bit about your current role, areas of expertise, and if you don't mind, just a little for our listeners on how the Khmer Rouge became one of these focus points for you, mate.
My name is Matthew Galway. I'm a senior lecturer at the Australian National University, focusing on Chinese history, specifically modern Chinese history. But I do have an extensive background in modern Cambodian studies, particularly with regard to the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the Khmer Rouge, and everything kind of post-independence, post-1953. Currently working on a book on locally recruited Gyal Chabu, or Central Investigation Department spies. I think the Chinese Communist Party CIA, or KGB, during the 1950s and 60s, and how these locally recruited intelligence agents and spies pushed forward for foreign policy goals of the CCP and other countries. Now, my focal point is Cambodia, which is often the case. It's the subject of my first book, The Emergence of Global Maoism. The China-Cambodia intellectual ideological connection in the post-war years. And I've always kind of found it fascinating how Mao Zedong thought and Mao Zedong Xixiang became such a global phenomenon. I initially did not intend to study modern China, but as an undergraduate, I kind of found it a fascinating story, the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, kind of the myths and legends around the Eighth Root Army and the great underdog story as weaved together by Edgar Snow, and the stories of the great Canadian, as a fellow Canadian, Norman Bethune, the famous doctor who fought with the CCP Red Armies and served on the front lines. So that kind of got me interested in uncovering more about the story and separating myth from fact. And then as I dug deeper, I realized that the influence of these stories, the Chinese revolutionary experience, was not exclusive to the Chinese mainland, but in fact had inspired many other communist parties worldwide. And one particularly gruesome case study is the Cambodian case study, where Mao's ideas and policies directly influenced the Communist Party of Kampuchea between 1975 and 1979.
Brilliant. And just on that, I guess I'm curious. So you studied in your undergrad in Canada, and how did you get over to Australia?
It was a long and winding road. So I initially, when everything started, I was really interested in the Aztecs. I cannot explain why, but I wanted to study at university. I wanted to learn Nahuatl. I wanted to essentially just dive right in. My dream was to go to Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City, which I've since done. It's amazing. But that was not possible at the University of Ottawa, or at least I did not receive encouragement in my first few classes from those early scholars who I inquired about what pathways I could take. So there I was, kind of directionless with what I was going to do. And I had this class with Dimitri Katsikas, and he had known Mao. And I just thought that this was a fascinating story. There's a guy who lived during a time about somebody I'm learning about, and he's long dead. And one thing led to another. I ended up kind of doing a bit of China stuff with Viren Murthy, a bit of Cambodia stuff with Michelin Lesar, one of my great mentors, and continues to support my work and be a really important kind of voice in my life when it comes to my studies and my learning of the region. And then somehow, some way, I ended up going back to Chinese studies, just feeling that I really wanted to uncover how Mao Zedong thought went global, how it left the bounds of the Chinese state. And that led me to study working with Tim Cheek. And I was very, very lucky to work with Tim Cheek. He took a chance on somebody who had a background in Cambodian history, someone who knew more Khmer than he knew Chinese. And he said, you know what, I'm interested in this. I'm gonna supervise this project and see how it goes. And I had to relearn how to do intellectual history. I had to relearn how to trace how ideas travel and look at the dialectical engagement. Because I had always just thought that, okay, it happened in China. Of course, they found it interesting and relevant in Cambodia, fighting against the French and wanting true independence, but actually kind of understanding how texts flow and how ideas are actually engaged with dialogically and dialectically by the people who are receiving them. And that eventually led me to write my dissertation, which became the foundation of my book. And then I ended up doing a postdoc at UC Berkeley. I had the privilege of working with Penny Edwards and for a brief time, Yeo and Shin, two of my academic mentors from afar. And then eventually was about to give everything up. And I interviewed for a few jobs. I'd had a few campus visits, and I was thinking to myself, maybe this just isn't going to work out for me. After this postdoctoral fellowship, I'm going to just give up and go teach in the Himalayas and have a wonderful experience, but probably not going to get an academic job. And the University of Melbourne was like kind of my last shot, and I got the job very, very luckily. Worked there for a few years, and then a new one opened up at ANU that was longer term and was on Chinese history specifically rather than just an Asia history position. And I took the job, and I've been here for the last 6 years.
Wow. Well, and between the University of Melbourne and ANU, that's quite the that's our Ivy League. That's quite something. Let's get into the topic of discussion here. Now, before we kick off, I did originally have an idea of just sort of getting people used to a little bit of the what Elizabeth Becker said on this program was commie speak. Slightly derisively, but I happen to be on her side of that one. So apologies to any still using those words socialists out there. But you dropped dialectic a couple of times in that introduction. And it is one of those words, I think, for people that have sort of a passing knowledge of this history that they might even Google a few times and they'll go, okay, all right. And then, a week later they'll forget. Now I share that story in that way because I've done that several times. But why don't you, and I might pull these words out as we go if and when they come up. So Matt, give us a working sort of give the layman something to work with when we're using the dialectic or dialectical materialism or these kinds of phrases in this context.
Well, it's a great question and an important one because it often, at least among academics, it can sometimes fall kind of in the rear view or outside of our field of vision that we use these concepts assuming that everybody knows what they mean. And I can tell you that Marx and Engels probably would not have wanted us to just kind of pontificate about these large concepts without any real view towards whether people can receive and understand them. And I can say certainly Mao would have said, well, this is a nice arrow, but until you shoot it to the target of the revolution or of the people, then it's going to be, and I quote him, less useful than dog shit. So in terms of dialectics, I've used dialectics in a very non-Marxist way and in a very Marxist way in my work. Now, in the Marxist sense, kind of dialectical materialism, Marxist dialectics really emphasize that there is indeed real conditions, real social conditions that exist, and we must stress the importance of them, and that in these social conditions there are contradictions within these conditions, and particularly among social classes and social relations. And these contradictions, whether they emerge in labor or socioeconomic interactions, what have you, they kind of are forces that oppose each other, but also develop mutually. So this is a very important concept for me because not exclusively because of Marx, obviously knowing Marx is kind of a prerequisite for doing any studies of communist parties, but particularly for Mao, who famously wrote an essay during his Yan'an years. So during the time when this Chinese Communist Party was fighting against the invading Imperial Japanese armies during the Second Sino-Japanese War. And he wrote this essay on contradiction, which analyzed the ways in which contradictions are just a permanent part of society, and that the revolution must always be vigilant and resolute in addressing, identifying these contradictions, but also acknowledging that there's no stamping them out, that you're always going to have kind of contradictions at the kind of real world level, and that the goal of a good Marxist is to analyze these contradictions and track how they develop mutually, and to frame policy and solutions to address those contradictions that are becoming particularly antithetical or problematic for the revolution, but also to accept that they are going to always be around.
And Matt, I feel like we've walked quite quickly into another one that we might want to just expand on a little bit for listeners, which is contradictions in this sense. So I recently I heard that explained quite well as almost, as you said, these are sort of built in certain ways, I guess, into society. I guess you could say that and it was explained to me almost in that there are fault lines that are just part of the Earth's mantle, and they will rub up against each other, and that will create a sort of energy and a pressure, and that's just sort of part of the way it is. But we're talking about this, I guess, in a class sense. So do you mind just giving sort of like what would like your everyday person sort of example be for a class contradiction, and why is it so important, I guess, to Marxism as a whole?
The contradiction is the central contradiction, as Marx identified, and of course, as Mao elaborated on in his essay, is between the proletariat, the working class, and the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie. And his main kind of point is that these classes had fundamentally oppositional interests that could only be that could simply not be reconciled within a pervasive capitalist system, and that essentially that a socialist revolution is the only way to solve the contradictions that are inherent in capitalism between these classes, and establish a society that is free of this type of exploitative system, and kind of recognizing that these kind of classes are in this kind of cycle of contradiction is an important prerequisite for both the parties we're going to look at today or discuss today in the podcast episode, because both of them, the Chinese Communist Party and the Communist Party of Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, will constantly use the word contradiction in explaining why the revolution must persist. And this is the kind of one of the core tenets of Mao Zedong thought, Buduan Geming, permanent revolution. He didn't invent it. I think it was a Trotsky invention. But Mao's development of it was that to resolve these contradictions at every level, and understanding that they're always going to be around, but to address them as they appear, as they become conflictual and a problem for the party in its pursuance of revolution, that they must continue the revolution and continuously be resolute. And this becomes a big watershed moment during the Cultural Revolution as well. And the Khmer Rouge will do the same thing with their revolution. They'll say that these contradictions are appearing in the countryside. There are enemies boring from within the party, to use their speak and their slogans, and that the revolutionary resoluteness is the solution. And people need to kind of put in more work and do this and that. And in both cases, you have disastrous results because of it. But in both cases, the party can justify its single party rule.
It's so interesting because we're kind of, I mean, before you started talking about disasters, but before that, when we were just talking about these sort of contradictions and class and exploitation and words like that, we're kind of actually getting back on track to where someone might be a student, let's say, in Paris in the early 1950s, and they're going to classes, maybe they're picking up a pamphlet. Probably people that are going to university today will probably still find someone giving them a pamphlet about something pretty similar. But I guess that's we're one or two steps away from actually where we wanted to go here. But since I've got you on these kind of definitions, I guess there's a way for us to talk about the Cambodian students in early 1950s Paris by kind of talking about the words that they would be using, and I guess the big concepts that were not only that they were using, but they found very appealing to them. So I guess while we're here, we've talked about dialectic and we've talked about contradictions here. I guess what I know that it's either Yang Sari or Khieu Samphan were very excited about, or they talked quite effusively about, is the science of Marxism. They always talk about how it's this scientific method. And I guess people that are sort of talking about that history now, they might look at that and say, well, why do communists think that they're what some might just call an economic theory, or they might say is sort of an economic reading of history, um, far away from talking about sort of some of the prophetical angles that I think are also very inherent to that theory. But why why do communists, or at least back in the 50s, why did they consider it a sort of scientific theory?
Well, it's a fantastic question, Lachlan, and it's one that I think it's very important for anybody digging into Marx after Marx, and that is because the especially people who are subscribe to Marxism or Marxism-Leninism, which is Marxism and Leninism developed by Stalin and then obviously engaged further with by Mao and his successors, is that Marx and Marx's theories, Marx's kind of examination of society is scientific in the sense that it's an understanding of social development that is as empirical and scientific as a scientific understanding of, say, of natural development, right? That human development, social development, is characterized by the same kind of constant movement, and indeed that these issues at the level of kind of social development and kind of issues between classes requires an empirical investigation. And this is why you have so many, I guess you could call it disciples of Marx, who do these extensive class analyses, breaking down different types of classes, trying to understand where there are particular grievances and social cleavages between them, and to try and analyze what is the root cause of these issues. Now, Mao will take this one step further with his rural investigations, where he goes to great lengths, sometimes hundreds of pages long, to explain, the different types of rural classes and what the kind of the main contradictions, the main issues that they face are. And again, he views this as scientific because, again, it's looking at how social development, kind of the processes of social development, with a view towards uncovering issues at the kind of the base level of these. And just think of it this way: is that, like, if the task of science is to really understand the laws of motion, of nature and society, then Marxism is, in its dialectical sense, is very much kind of seeing history as the process of evolution of humanity and the aims of discovering kind of the laws therein. And I think that that's what some would view as makes it very scientific. And just a small sidebar: I don't think that all Marxists approach Marxism in this way as scientific. And it's very, very important to note this in the case of what makes Marxism appealing for would-be communists in the developing world and the colonial world. Marxism, for a small group of very educated, philosophical, advanced study folk, is appealing in this sense, but where it becomes useful is as a program for removing colonialism. And this is really important in Southeast Asia. The people who became Marxists, like Hou Yuon, Hu Nim, Khieu Samphan, Pol Pot, then Solat Sar, and Yang Sari, they were interested in reading about Marx. They were doing this in Paris in the Cercle Marxiste. But what made Marx and Marxism appealing was not the scientificness of it, but its utility as a practical program for assessing problems in society and then launching a revolution against it. And they become communists in some senses before they ever become Marxists.
That's exactly what I was going to get to next, which is sort of, you can imagine someone saying, "Hey, here is a scientific theory," and go, "Well, that's very nice." But then they back it up with, and it has a promise. It has something to deliver, and it's exactly as you say. It's these people that are. I know we're going to get to this eventually, but I can't help but talk about this almost in this sort of proselytizing manner, where you have people eager for a message, and they get a message, just as you say. Thank you so much for that. I think that's a really good primer, actually, for what we're going to talk about, which is early 1950s Paris, as you say, the Cercle Marxiste. We have a group of perhaps 250 students who have lived in Paris for sometimes a few years, sometimes not very long at all, and they're at a really important moment, I guess you could say, in world history and for their own country's history, and they're receiving this message. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the so-called intellectuals, because I think some people, when they talk about the Khmer Rouge, they can fall into a few different camps, I suppose. But one of the generalizations that people will often do is that the Khmer Rouge were, uh, yes, broadly a peasant revolution, or they'll use some kind of term like that, but they'll say it was led by a group of Paris-led intellectuals, which I think was sort of a very 80s thing that sort of came about and stuck in many ways. But what they're really talking about there is that there is a core that will go on to have a lot of influence in the Cambodian Revolution. It's not everyone, not everyone's part of this Paris intellectual group, but a good number are. Um, and I guess while listeners to the podcast will know, we've sort of really covered the who will end up in the leadership in those episodes, like Salazar and Yang Sari and people like that, and to a lesser extent Tiong Mum. But I think, well, if I was to do a bit of to borrow the Leninist phrase, if I did a bit of self-criticism, I would say that I feel like I've neglected the influence of Hou Yuon in particular. So I was hoping, because I read a great paper by you on him, I was hoping you could introduce us to Hou Yuon as a member of the Cambodian student group in Paris in the early 50s, and just give us a bit of a sense of who this guy was and what his influence was in that time.
Great question. Any opportunity to talk about Hou Yuon, I'm going to jump at that chance because I find him absolutely fascinating. And he's part of the history of global Maoism, part of the history of Marxism in Asia, and part of the history of the Khmer Rouge, even though he does not have a particularly long shelf life with the party. Now, Hou Yuon and Hu Nim, both of whom I've written about quite a bit, but I'll stick to Hu Yuon here, is fascinating because he has very humble origins, right? Khieu Samphan and Salazar Pol Pot both grew up in pretty wealthy rural households, but wealthy rural households, not unlike now. Growing up rural does not mean growing up poor, but it does mean that there are certain things you have to deal with. Now, Hou Yuon had to deal with a lot more. He grew up in a very poor rural household. It was a long trajectory of hard work that had very many winding roads, but eventually through talent and skill led to him getting one of these very, very prestiged positions in the Collège Notre-Dame Sihanouk, this French language middle school. I guess it's the equivalent of a middle school. A collège in Cambodia would be a middle school. Lycée would be a high school. And he shows himself to be a very keen student with a kind of a very kind of intellectual approach to his studies. Of course, education in Cambodia, the French protectorate of Cambodia at this time, is very much in the French mold. The prism, I think Philip Short called it French, the prism through which everyone interpreted the world in Cambodia. Yeah. And indeed, a lot of these intellectuals will use that to, especially students like Hou Yuon, who show great promise, to marshal that into a bursary to go study in France with a view towards becoming a civil servant in the colony, or specifically the protectorate.
Can I
And
just
Hou
ask,
Yuon
Matt?
is one of these guys. Yeah.
So sorry to interrupt, mate, but you mentioned the College Sihanouk. That's the same school that Saab went to in Kampong Tom, right? No, sorry, Kampong Cham. And
Yeah.
were they in the same? Because it's I always describe it as this, this small world of Cambodia, and it's so interesting how many how this little group in many ways is there from sort of the 40s until the 2000s, still today. But do you know if they were in the exact same class? Because I know that Samphan was, and I'm not sure if Hou Yuon knew Sa from that early age as well. Because it's interesting because they become quite close in Paris as well.
They all went to the same school, not all at the same time, but
Okay.
they kind of, but ultimately, what will matter is they end up becoming kind of part of the same cohort in Paris. And the thing about Hou Yuon and Khieu Samphan is they matriculated through the school. They showed great promise. the French administration wanted to reward some domestic students with a foreign education to come back and become civil servants in a protectorate they did not see themselves giving up anytime soon. Again, the French folly. We can that I'll leave that to the Penny Edwards of the world to dig into, because yeah, the French conceit too. Michael Van's book's really good about that too. But they will all meet up in Paris. I think, if I recall, Solotzar was not a particularly keen student in Paris or before, and he actually ended up getting to Paris kind of the circuitous route, because he ended up studying at the École Miche, which was like a trade school.
That's how I
then yeah, so he, I think that humbled him a little bit. It also attuned him, as David Chandler shows in his great book, Brother Number One, that it kind of attuned him to like the issues that everyday Cambodians had to deal with. Whereas Hou Yuon grew up in that. He was, to borrow from Bain, like, I was molded by it. This whole idea of growing up in rural Cambodia, seeing and experiencing rural poverty at a time, like going through the Great Depression, at a very young age, understanding and perceiving the struggles of Cambodians. It's why Hou Yuon devoted his life to people in the agricultural sector, I think. Same with Hou Yuon. And when they all go to Paris, they're all very interested. They're largely apolitical. This is something I said in my book. Ben Kiernan said this in How Pol Pot Came to Power. And it's really like, if they were going to go any direction, they were going to go towards Samphan and the Democrats movement. The Democrat Party was that first real kind of repository for Cambodian nationalism, or at least, if we're going to have independence, let's make sure it's real independence. But they grow very disillusioned with it. And Hou Yuon is one of the first guys to really fall in with alternatives. And he finds himself gravitating towards a more kind of like critical interpretive paradigm of the situation in Cambodia, one that doesn't see independence as the solution to Cambodia's socioeconomic problems. And he's one of the kind of big figures to fall in with the French Communist Party. And he'll join the Groupe de Langue, or the language groups, which is kind of a subgroup of the Cercle Marxist. And all of it is connected to the French Communist Party at this time. He'll become a card-carrying member of that party. And in these groups, they'll read lots of works, Marx, Lenin, Mao, and they'll, again, all with a view towards getting true independence, getting rid of Sihanouk, though they can't say so openly because they like their scholarships. But this is where Hou Yuon really becomes kind of the most adept at Marxist readings and interpreting Marxism among the group. And I think he's probably the only one out of the future kind of what I call the collective leadership of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, who really, really dug into Marx and took him seriously. I think the others did to a degree, but only with a view towards, again, that goal of achieving true independence. I think that Hou Yuon appreciated Marx and Lenin and Mao for their insights, however imperfect his application was in his dissertation.
I think that's so interesting because, yeah, I guess how I was trying to frame that initially was that, yeah, when people talk about these intellectuals in Paris, sometimes it's quite dismissive because they'll say, but Salotsar was an intellectual, and it's like, okay, well, he went to a trade school. But they'll throw Yingsari into that as well, who was doing, tertiary education. But you don't often, it's like you said, you don't often hear of the Hou Yuon who's doing his PhD in economics and is, by everyone's possible standards, an intellectual. I wanted to tie in a few threads here with the influence that this person has. We've just established sort of his upbringing and how he gets here and how he. I mean, you must imagine this must be a clearly brilliant person to be plucked from obscurity in a colonial empire where they didn't care about educating the locals one bit, and they've said, oh no, this guy, he's special. So we're talking about someone like that. And I think it's very interesting. So yeah, we talk about people in the podcast will remember as well how the influence of the Khmer Student Association, and then they start these informal study groups, and then that sort of evolves into like there's a secret extra group if they think that you might be interested in this more subversive material. And as you say, it's all connected very much to the French Communist Party, and they started adapting some of the same sort of structures as well. So they're divided into cells, and they have these extra little segregated study groups. And I believe Hou Yuon is in the 3-person group with Salot Sa. So it strikes me that they would be doing these readings together. Sa, as you mentioned, is is not the most adept student, but he was given it his best. I find that people are also a little too dismissive of Sa, like he couldn't read at all or couldn't tie his shoes. So he was a switched on guy. He could remember French poetry. He knew what he was doing.
Love Victor Hugo. Like it's
Exactly.
not. Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's very easy for us to kind of look back on these people and write kind of a post mortem on their seriousness and their intellectual insights. I think we have to take them seriously, and they took their Marxism and their Maoism very seriously to the point where they believed in a revolution. They were willing to lay down life and limb to fight for it, and even die for it, and then subject their people to what happens between 75 and 79. Salazar is not a particularly gifted student, but he knew which people to be around, and he was very, very keen. Like Mao was a great survivor in the 30s and 40s to be able to see people like Wang Ming and the returned students, the 28 Bolsheviks, and to kind of say like, how do I survive that? Well, I'll prove myself as a good military man and as a good strategist, and that's how I can rise to supreme theorist. Yunnan rectification helps too, but with Salazar, his first mentor is Kang Ban-sak. And Kang Ban-sak himself is not a communist. He dabbled in it a little bit, but this is a guy who was really kind of trying to write about original culture, right? This is why Pol Pot's first political writing, he doesn't write it as Salazar, he writes it as Khmer Daim, the original Khmer. Now, many members of the Paris group will do that when writing for Khmer Nisut, the Khmer student newspaper publication that they put out. But Kang Man-sak is a huge influence on Pol Pot. And it's one that really emphasizes kind of I don't want to say purity, but like the need to preserve kind of Khmer cultural norms that are undisturbed by outside influences. Now Kang Man-sak goes all the way back and says that Buddhism is even one of these, and that we need to go back to and it's atavistic in a very kind of slippery slope kind of way, but it's fascinating because I think Kang Man-sak is an oft overlooked influence on the Khmer Rouge's ideology. Now Hou Yuon comes into the picture, particularly as you pointed out in the Cercle Marxist, because he's very central. Right? He's part of one of the founders and organizers of the Association Générale des Étudiants Khmer, or the Khmer General Students Association of Khmer students, and he's part of several other kind of French Communist Party groups as well. And he's writing this dissertation that he'll finish in 1955 that will become the foundation for Samphan's dissertations. Andrew Murtha has even said that it's arguably derivative, that he took the only good parts of that are kind of from that. I don't want to paraphrase Andy, but and arguably Hou Yuon's dissertation that he finishes at Université Royale Khmer, which is now the Royal University of Phnom Penh, comes out in 65, 10 years later, is they do the same thing. Each of them had the same kind of class analysis in the Maoist style. So Hou Yuon's influence on that inner circle of Paris-educated intellectuals, all of whom got PhDs, is evident. There's a textual record for that. And then in terms of the non-textual record, Hou Yuon becoming a card-carrying member of the party, well, Pol Pot does that too. So does Yang Sari. And Hou Yuon is himself very interested in theory, but he's always got a practical mindset. He's always like, how does this relate to sorting out issues in the agricultural sector? How do we apply these ideas and give them currency for Cambodia's situation? So my view, and I point this out in the third chapter of my book, is that this, along with all the other influences in Pol Pot's life in Paris, will actually spur him and Yang Sari to go back to Cambodia without finishing their degrees and join the Communist Front or the Communist Party there and join the movement and do something. A big influence for Pol Pot is also going to Zagreb and working on the highway there, but essentially like him realizing that theory without practice is just dogma, and that we really need to go and do this. We need to bring the revolution forward. And that's why he goes back without a degree much earlier than all of the three ghosts.
That's such an interesting take, and I love that as well because for so long it was just he went to Zagreb and he saw people working and he said, "Yeah, I'll do that," and or he ran out of his scholarship and he came home. And I'm sure it is, as you say, it's a confluence of these things. But I love the idea of Hou Yuon sort of. Well, I'm going to finish my dissertation. You guys, if you want to live this life, there's things going on back home. Okay, well that actually neatly and so I'm so glad you mentioned Andrew Murtha's book because I was thinking I've written down here that he's influenced Samphan and Hu Nim's dissertation. Where did I where did I learn that? And I'd forgotten where I'd found that fact. Thank you for that. Okay, so that sort of neatly brings us to this, I guess you could say, a kind of split. So it's 1953, it's the end of the French War. But as listeners will know, we covered the end of the French War. We know what happened there. We know what happened with Saar in the Maquis. Let's stick with who we're going to call the three ghosts for a while. So Hu Yuon stays on. Do you think, or have you detected that there is a kind of, we've just talked about this influence in Paris itself, but then not only do the Khmer party sort of split from the Vietnamese influence and then split from the Khmer Vietnamese influence, which we covered at length, but I'm wondering where does this intellectual split happen as well, if at all, in your eyes? Because before long, sort of Saar is going to become leader of the KWP. He is going to with Nuon Chea sort of develop what I consider to be a sort of Khmer communist ideology over that sort of decade from sort of 1960 to 1970. And I guess I'm curious, sort of listeners to the show will recall that the three ghosts, well, they're not always called the three ghosts. That's only in 1967 once they're presumed dead at the hands of Sihanouk. But up until then, the reason why they had that sort of, I'm not sure if epithet's the right word there, but they had this phrase used for them. It's because everyone knew them. They were really prominent politicians. They were well respected in their communities. In the Sankum government, they were very important. I would, I guess, extend that to even people that were outside Cambodia, foreigners would have seen the Cambodian parliament and been very sort of aware of these figures. And I guess we know that Sihanouk, he played the left and the right against each other quite a bit. He used these young, almost like the whiz kids for McNamara. He had these sort of socialist whiz kids, and he was like, yeah, these guys are going to sort it out, and if they don't, well, I can blame them, and I win. But during that period, I'm curious because I tend to think that the real CPK, the real Communist Party of Kampuchea, are sort of distancing themselves from this real intellectual part of the Cambodian communist movement as well. So I'm wondering, where do you think, and apologies for how meandering this question went, but I guess it is a meandering story. But yeah, where do you see someone like Hou Yuon's influence in this period in the 60s, I guess I could say?
Something I explore in my book, The Emergence of Global Maoism, right? As you mentioned, Salotsar Pol Pot goes back without finishing his degree, Young Sari too, and they go the revolutionary route. We're going to change Cambodia from the countryside surrounding the cities. Hou Yuon, Khieu Samphan, and Hu Nim say we're going to do the reformist route. We're going to go and fix the system from within, do it politically, because that is the only way to do it. They've got every reason to think that is the only way to do it. Sihanouk has been strong-arming Cambodian politics, dissolving parliament before independence, pretty much doing everything imaginable under the sun to keep the Democrat Party from emerging as a serious threat to his rule. They don't believe he's earnest, right? This is the topic of Pol Pot's first political essay, Monarchy or Democracy, which, by the way, fun to translate handwritten Khmer from the 1950s. And I think it's a fascinating look at Pol Pot's kind of early ideological development, but also in particular, it's a foundational national text. If it's you want to understand how the Khmer Rouge becomes the Khmer Rouge, look to 1952. In that political essay, democracy is the wave of change. It's kind of like Mao's great movement of the popular masses or great union of the popular masses, right? This is the current, we must embrace it. And it's he criticizes Sihanouk. He says he's dancing to the colonialist tune of the French. I think he even derides him for having a seraglio. Like it's really quite charged language. No wonder he had to publish it anonymously as Khmer Daim. But this is the thing, is these guys arrive in Marseille and then Paris apolitical, and they will pivot slowly but surely towards the Tanist Democrat route. And then when they see that the Democrats are just never going to succeed, Sihanouk is just going to keep power for himself, and he's beloved and popular throughout the country. Hou Yuon, Samphan, and Hu Nim think the reformist route is the best solution. So they decide they're going to join the parliament. They're going to get elected in overwhelming numbers. They're going to become very popular leftist ministers. And look, I can criticize Sihanouk in the 50s and 60s until the cows come home, but I also can understand that he was trying to maintain his policy of neutrality. Sihanouk had a very strong right wing in his parliament. He had a very strong, or at least an emergent progressive left wing in his parliament, and his goal was to keep some kind of balance. And that will really be offset, as my book explores, and the current one that I'm writing explores, when the PRC, People's Republic of China and Cambodia, normalized relations, and the PRC starts kind of gradually, but importantly, ginning up the kind of cultural revolution enthusiasm in the 60s. Then Sihanouk really has to clap down on the political left, as well as the kind of leftist curiosity and China curiosity that's emerging in his country. So this is why these intellectuals really take this reformist route. They're not completely outside of the orbit of the Communist Party, right? They're aware, and some are even involved with the Prechechon, which is the legal front organization of the Communist Party working in Phnom Penh. I think they even run in a few elections. They're not very successful. They are aware of what's going on in the countryside, maybe not as acutely as those who are fighting it. But I'd say that the split really occurs in a kind of Yan'an style, like in China, only after the party takes power. Now, these guys eventually, as you pointed out, Lachlan, in 1967, they will feel that the threats from Sihanouk against them, their Hou Yuon or Hu Nim goes to China as part of the Khmer Chinese Friendship Association, the Samakam Piep Khmer Chain. They'll go to China. He'll even say, like, the East Wind will triumph over the West. I got a picture from a Chinese newspaper, Mekong Ribao, which has Hu Nim's picture in it, and he actually looks healthy. I only know Hu Nim from the liberated zones, but it's like him in China on this delegation, speaking about how China and Mao and Maoism will triumph. So Sihanouk is rightly concerned, but he takes a heavy-handed approach and threatens his leftist ministers with a tribunal, with surreptitious arrest. So when they flee, what is a really kind of tactical move by the emergent Communist Party of Kampuchea, now having made its Maoist pivot in 66, is to use the popular faces of these politicians who had proven during their tenures in the cabinet or the tenures in the National Assembly that they cared about peasant grievances. So these guys were the public face of a Communist Party that had maintained clandestinity largely throughout its actions. Now, people knew who these people were in the liberated zones or in the rural areas, but having the public face of a Hou Yuon, a Hu Nim, a Khieu Samphan gave them street cred in many respects. Like this is the kind of the union of Yan'an Maoism, to use reference to my mentor Timothy Cheek, is the union of that kind of urban intellectual left with the rural left that had dabbled in intellectualism. And these guys come together in a harmonious sense, and it works for the revolution. And then eventually, with Sihanouk getting overthrown by Lon Nol in the bloodless coup in 1970, that gives Sihanouk eventually, with Chinese encouragement, the final piece missing. And now Sihanouk becomes the public face. And that's what's really going to bring a lot of peasants, people in the agricultural sector, farmers, workers, people who would otherwise not care about these intellectuals, or only be kind of timidly interested in this movement, to really throw their weight behind it.
Yeah, I think I spent about 3 to 4 hours in the podcast, making sure people were so aware of how important that proclamation that Sihanouk makes in, I think, yeah, April. Oh no, it would have been late March 1970. And as you say, it's a really good way of putting it. Here's that final piece of the puzzle because it's on top of the three ghosts who are these public-facing intellectuals. And I believe, if it's in, I think, Short's book, where Pol Pot's in Beijing and he signs the sort of endorsement of Sihanouk's proclamation and joining of the front, the Grunk and the Funk, he signs it from the three ghosts, and that for in Sihanouk's memoir, he's quite touched by this, and even the intellectuals that I used to threaten their deaths, and people had thought I'd burnt in acid and run over with a bulldozer. We'd had some run-ins in the past, but it was all cool, and we were together in this coalition, or so he thought. Um, we can talk perhaps a little bit then, because you brought it up, and I had to learn it to put it in the podcast, and it took me months, and I'm not, it's one of these topics where I'm not exactly sure with how good I could have given it. I did my best, but I think all up in the podcast we've spent about 3 hours on the Great Leap Forward and about 2 hours on the Cultural Revolution in two separate episodes, spaced apart by a couple of years. And as you mentioned, in 1966 and 67, when the Cultural Revolution happens, it's this sort of bewildering thing that is occurring, and as you mentioned, Sihanouk kind of has to be concerned because he's got Chinese Khmers sort of walking around with little red books, and it's for someone who's worried about, maybe of all the plates he's spinning, that maybe the leftist one is kind of spinning out of control. And it's so right how much of a catalyst that is, because then he's now reassessing the deals he has with the NLF and and Hanoi, and perhaps maybe that's why Jackie Kennedy is visiting Cambodia in the end of 1967, and perhaps this leads to this hot pursuit discussion with Chester Bowles at the start of 1968. So you can tell listeners will be aware. I'm very glad that Matt is nodding along right now, because this is what it takes to to properly tell this story, because it involves so many interlocking mechanisms, and that's why it's so fascinating to so many people. But you brought up the Cultural Revolution. We are going to spend most of the rest of this interview talking about Maoism generally, but since you brought it up, then what in a word, obviously not, but what was the Cultural Revolution? What was the point of it? Because um, it, I think, for anyone just passing by who looked into the window of the Chinese home in that period, they would have thought, why have they set fire to their own house, and what's going on in there?
Well, it is a fascinating thing. And to do it in one word, what is the Cultural Revolution? Chaos. But in terms of what actually, I mean, that's what the Chinese call it. They call it 10 years of chaos nowadays. But the Cultural Revolution it's important to know, is really something that comes as an outgrowth of the Great Leap Forward, right? The Great Leap Forward is an abject disaster. Mao has to fall on his sword, so to speak, because it was his baby, right? To advance, to leap from one stage to another and surpass England in steel production, and to rival the Soviet Union and the United States in these categories. And China's not able to do that. And it comes at a grotesque human cost. And the party has broken the bridge of trust that it had spent years, decades building with the rural sector in the country. So Mao has to semi-retire, which the wonderful book by Tim Chika, Propaganda and Culture in Mao's China, explores this to some degree in the post-leap retrenchment period. So after the Great Leap is aborted by the CCP. And Liu Shaoqi rises, and he starts to kind of like oversee the CCP mending that broken bridge of trust with the countryside. And Mao's still around. He's still around. He's still an important figure, and he's certainly aware of what's going on. And one thing that kind of really sets ablaze the Khmer fire is the socialist education movement, which emerges after the Great Leap Forward, and it's an effort to stamp out kind of the problematic tendencies within the party and at the rural sector. Again, delivering on their promises to peasants and workers to stamp out these contradictions in society, or at least identify them and use the mass line to interpret and fix, etc. And the view is that as this is happening, Liu Shaoqi has kind of overseen some bad tendencies in trying to reestablish this bridge of trust with the countryside and within the party, and he'll become kind of this bête noire in some respect, and those who are really loyal to Mao, like the Lin Biaos, his third wife, Jiang Qing, your Zhang Chunchaos, they are going to come up and say, "Oh, the problem with the Great Leap Forward was not there was too much Mao. It's that there wasn't enough Mao, and that the only way for us to reestablish our course, continue along the permanent revolution, Buduan Guming, is to reinsert Mao and just to let him just go nuts, and just say that we need to have more Mao. Mao needs to be omnipresent, and this is kind of the returning of Mao to undisputed CCP leadership. He's again still the leader, but in semi-retirement. And the Cultural Revolution is this kind of this attempt to stamp out the four olds, old thinking, old culture, old society, in reestablishing the vision that Mao had in his talks at the Yan'an Forum in 1942. There's no art for art's sake, that we need to have working class art. I don't know why they settled on accordions as working class instruments. I don't know. But essentially that's what the Cultural Revolution is. It's this Maoist turn back to Maoism by people who become what Tim Cheek has called faith Maoists. People were a little lighter on the theory, but heavy on the faith in Mao Zedong and his vision for China. And the results are an abject disaster, as you know. A really good book for listeners who want to learn more about the Cultural Revolution. There's the fun reading, which is Mao's Last Revolution by Roderick McFarquhar and Michael Shenholz. And then one that I particularly like, it's little old Lin T. White's Policies of Chaos, where he gets into the roots of kind of these core themes and trends that actually predate the Cultural Revolution, but explain why the Cultural Revolution happened. And I think those are really good reads if one wants to get a really good sense of the sinews leading into the Cultural Revolution.
And I guess, as you sort of mentioned there, it's Tsar, I believe, makes he, or Pol Pot, or I think he was going just by Pol, according to some people at that point. It's not exactly clear. But he visits sort of unknown, isn't it? It's like end of 65 into 66. Yep. So he's there right on the cusp of this. But again, since we covered that in the podcast, listeners, go back and listen to that one again. But you mentioned Hu Nim. Now, we're talking about these intellectuals, I guess, we can connect the dots there between back in Paris. Yes, they're reading Mao. They're also, heavily influenced by this Stalinist French Communist Party, and they're reading, the classics of communist philosophy. Now, by the late 60s, for them, I believe, and you mentioned Ken Van Sak before, I think he has this central quote, which is sort of, we started as kind of Stalinists, and I always imagine him at sort of a dinner party kind of vibe. And he was sort of leading some of the conversations. We started as Stalinists, and then that sort of didn't really fit, so we became Maoists instead. And by 67, so is Hu Nim, you mentioned you had the photo of him, he's there in 67 during the Cultural Revolution, or is it beforehand?
He's there on a very curated tour.
Okay.
And this is the before the Sihanouk closes the Khmer Chinese Friendship Association, which is itself in many respects very Maoist, as people have noted, and I've written about them before in my article Red Service Intellectual on Purging. But he's there in as part of this delegation, and he's the delegation gets to see a little bit of what China is like under Mao, and it's they're not going and seeing issues in the rural sector, and they're not going seeing public displays of humiliation. People wearing dunce caps getting marched through the streets. They're not seeing the Red Guards admonishing their teachers and their parents even.
Mm.
the hypervigilance and hypersurveillance that emerged during Wenhua Dageming, the Cultural Revolution. It's all they're seeing will end, right? It serves to show that the Chinese Revolution is the beacon of light guiding global communist revolution, but also to show Chinese reading audiences and those who are in attendance that look at all the good we're doing. We're actually the protectors of world peace. We're even meeting with people from a country run by a reactionary prince. It's the Soviet Union that's the problem. The Soviet Union likes war, and they're revisionists. They're the ones who are trying to disown Stalin and his contributions as a Marxist theorist. So it serves those ends as well. And Hu Nim's visit, it's not the only one. Obviously, you have a few very high-profile Cambodian visits. Sihanouk went several times, as Julio Heldres has covered in his book. He was personal friends with Zhou Enlai, and he'll spend several years actually in China in exile. So it's part of that kind of ongoing friendship between the two countries. And the Chinese language presses in Cambodia are very, very like front news at every one of those visits, and it becomes a really, really, really important message to sell. And in particular, one newspaper that I've looked at in my work, Minhua Ribao, Sino-Khmer Daily, is the official propaganda outlet of the PRC embassy in Phnom Penh. So they're selling that to the not insignificant overseas Chinese Huaqiao population, as well as the kind of Sino-Cambodian population, as I call it, because they're not identifying as Chinese until there is a China in 1912. So, and these populations are really kind of like, oh, we're reading this in our newspapers. Look at Sihanouk. Oh my God, so much support for Sihanouk and neutrality. And look, there he is meeting with Mao and receiving a medal for his stance on anti-imperialism. This is a very big kind of galvanizing force in Cambodia and throughout the kind of the Chinese diaspora, specifically in the mainland, that really highlights the importance of these visits and the importance of the China-Cambodia friendship at this time, until 1967, when the Cultural Revolution enthusiasm becomes way too firebrand, way too agitating, and Sihanouk trying to maintain his neutrality, and he'll actually clamp back on that. He'll shut down every Chinese language newspaper, shut down the Friendship Association, not let people visit China anymore, at least not in a formal delegation sense. And he'll even, I think, tell Zhou Enlai, like, can you tell the people to calm down? Like, this is not good for me. Keep your Red Guard diplomacy at home, please. And that will ultimately lead, over the course of the next few years, to the rise of the right in Cambodian politics.
Exactly. Okay, so I guess we're sort of approaching again 1970. It's this sort of watershed year in the story. And I guess we can say it's when the three ghosts are back within the revolution, the early revolutionary years and the war to take Cambodia. I guess because we're going to talk all about Maoism and the Khmer Rouge in the next bit, I just wanted to, I guess, wrap up with the three ghosts, and if there's anything about this period where we're sort of putting their influence, where we've shown where these influences come from, but I guess one way we could talk about how that influence sort of ended up in the party was two of the three ghosts will be purged by Pol Pot, and not just removed from their positions, but sent to S21 and killed. So Hu Nim and Hou Yuon, I believe Hou Yuon it's almost very soon after the regime takes power. And as everyone will know, Khieu Samphan is, as time of recording, still alive. So I guess if we're going to wrap up a sort of discussion about the influence of these intellectuals, I guess we could maybe kick that conversation off by saying, well, why did Khieu Samphan survive? Was this down to just personal circumstances, or was it something that he wasn't saying or was saying, or was it down to an ideological difference between, say, a Pol Pot and a Hou Yuon?
Well, it's a fascinating question. I mean, Hou Yuon and Hu Nim were always outspoken. These were guys who shot from the hip. Maybe it's from their rural upbringing. They just did not, read the room in a way that prevented or shielded them from the ire of Pol Pot. These are guys who, of course, took the party's Marxism-Leninism seriously. I know that obviously Pol Pot and Wen Che and Young Sari did, but in a very different way, as I cover in my book. Hou Yuon and Hunim were not very keen on the full evacuation of cities. They were not very keen on the abolition of currency, the defrocking and even killing of Buddhist monks, which, as Ian Harris's great book, Buddhism in a Dark Age shows, began quite early, even before the party had seized state power on 17 April 75. And because they were outspoken, they kind of fell into this very dangerous liminal space where the party could just do away with them. And Hou Yuon was the first to really be outspoken about this, and he'll die in pretty early, 75 or 76, we don't know, very mysterious circumstances that the party will have him killed. Some say he's just kind of thrown into a ditch outside of Phnom Penh and shot. Others say that they took him to Tuol Sleng and killed him. I've been to Tuol Sleng more times than I'd like to admit, and I try and imagine any of those cells containing him. Hou Yuon's kind of this larger than life figure. I can't imagine. I think that he would have been too dangerous to put in proximity in other people and too influential. Hunim, we know, died in 77, and he wrote these very lengthy confessions, many of which I've had to read through, also handwritten, and telling us more about the torturer than the tortured, but still nevertheless shedding light on his early life experiences and giving us some way of understanding how he got to the ideas that influenced him for the rest of his life. And Hunim was also outspoken. He got done in a very Maoist style, like Cultural Revolution style, through his connections to other people who were more just as problematic or threatening to the party as him. But ultimately, by that point, the party is looking for scapegoats for why the revolution has gone off the rails. And this is one of the main features of the Khmer Rouge in power is finding enemies, real and imagined, mostly imagined, and then executing them. Part of it is grievance on the rural-urban divide, the monopoly of commerce by quote-unquote Chinese and Vietnamese, something that all three of the guys examine in their dissertations, the prevalence of usury at the rural sector level and the disproportionate concentration and fragmentation of land ownership, and this idea of, let's just get rid of the Vietnamese, they're the eternal enemy, they're always plotting to destroy us from within, etc. And then they're like, okay, well, we've gotten rid of all of them. Now we need to get rid of Khmers with Vietnamese minds. All right, so like this whole idea that you can be a Khmer, you can be a Cambodian, but if you don't work as hard, or you are a reactionary and have this longing for society, for pre-revolutionary Cambodia, then you have a Vietnamese mind. We have to get rid of you. And Hunim falls into that category, at least in the sense that they want to blame him for working for the Vietnamese, working for the CIA, anything that torturers would make him admit. And they execute him in May or early June 1977. And Khieu Maos is another one. He actually traveled with Pol Pot on his way to China. He gets a liver disorder, falls ill or something like that, and he can't actually make the trip to China in the end. But he's also, Stephen Heder has translated some of his forced confessions, and he dies saying, "Long live Mao Zedong thought." So a lot of people very kind of connected the dots and thought that maybe it's the people who were the rational bureaucratic Maoists, the managerial Maoists, the people who still believe that the revolution must occur in stages and that there's certain preconditions that you need to achieve before you move to the next stage, and to not commit the grievous errors that Mao did with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Funny enough, the Khmer Rouge will do both of those in their own versions. And because they call the party on that and criticize their attempt at single-step socialism or pure socialism, that they are ultimately put at the end of the sword. And I think that's one of, this is kind of harking back to what you're saying. When is there an intellectual break? It pretty much occurs instantly in 1975 when they take step power. Those people who want to support the Pol Pot regime and the Pol Potist brand of Maoism, those are the ones who are going to survive. And Khieu Samphan is one of them. Andy Murtha has called him a water carrier in discussions I've had with him. That his work is derivative of Hou Yuon's. There's nothing really great there. Most of the stuff that's in there that's of any utility is Samira Min's work, the Franco-Egyptian Maoist, who was very influential on these Paris group intellectuals at the time, and that he was just kind of like there and was understood that the current within the party was changing, and he didn't want to be identified with the outspoken folk. And I still haven't read a definitive biography of Khieu Samphan, just his two French language publications, and of course his dissertation, which I meticulously printed off from the Purges library in Paris. So the extent to which he was a major influence on the party's policies, I think, is actually quite minimal. And I would agree with Andy in stating that he's more of a glorified water carrier at this point. That's how he survives.
Yeah, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I guess there's so much we can dive into there on you know, the influence of ideology versus, well, did in practice, what did this mean, and how different was like what is Maoism in practice versus what is Maoism in theory, and which one sort of led to these purveyors of this thought sort of dying by the sword there, living by it and dying by it. But I guess a way of getting into all of that is segueing here away from the Khmer Rouge strictly and into, I guess, perhaps it's best to just start with an idea of like, why is Maoism unique? Is it just another variant of communism? Why is it so hard to define? Why is it that people will still sort of unironically call themselves Maoists today? Why does it have this staying power? And how did it become this blueprint, both for sort of fighting a war as well as running a revolution and a country, and as we've seen in these tragic instances in Cambodia, and sort of a blueprint for disaster? I realize there's about 10 questions in there, so I guess what I'm really saying, Matt, is you're an expert on Maoism. Tell me and tell the listeners what it is.
I'll do my best to keep this succinct, because you could go in many different directions. The first one, I could ask questions back and stating which Maoism or which Mao Zedong thought, right? And I think that ultimately we're getting down to, there are two things to really point out here. Mao Zedong thought, Mao Zedong Xiciang, is the application by Mao of Marxism-Leninism, so Marxism as developed by Lenin and then by Stalin, to the concrete realities of China, the historical realities as he interpreted and perceived them, fighting with the communists in the 1930s, fighting against the Japanese in the early 40s, without the abandonment of the universality, the purported universality of Marxism-Leninism, stating we're going to apply these ideas to the realities as we see them in China, because Marxism and Leninism, European products, European analysis, critical interpretive paradigms of Europe. How do we apply these to Chinese realities and conditions? What's going on in China with our semi-feudalism and semi-colonialism? How do we interpret things happening in our sectors? We don't have a big industrial working class, but we have a lumpen proletariat, an agricultural working class. So that is Mao Zedong's thought. It is the application of Marxism-Leninism to specific realities and conditions in China without abandoning the purported universality. So that allows Mao Zedong thought to become Maoism, and then global Maoism, as we see, or Maoism as exported from China. Maoism is the further development of Mao Zedong thought in implementation. It is what the party implements during its time in power, taking Mao Zedong thought, putting into practice with, for instance, consolidating its power through the anti-rightist campaign, the 100 Flowers campaign, through its land reform movement, which predates and then overlaps with the founding of the People's Republic, and of course the suppression of counter-revolutionaries. Yang Huisong's written a great essay, very revolutionary, in pointing out how the party actually targeted people it wanted to kill and set quotas, which is a hugely important thing to compare with, of course, the Khmer Rouge. And then Maoism becomes Maoism as exported model, becomes a traveling ideological system, as I pointed out, Xiciang Tichi, as it goes beyond and really emphasizes outside of China's borders the importance of creative adaptation. Now, Mao never once in his entire writings, as far as I know, and I've read a fair bit at this point, says that you must adhere to a specific model at all times without understanding realities in your specific conditions. So in saying you want to be a good Marxist-Leninist, he's saying, well, there's nothing wrong with creative adaptation, right? You're going to perceive realities and conditions, historical situations in specific settings. And there's, just as he did with the sinification of Marxism, you're going to have to make adaptations. that fit your conditions specifically. That doesn't mean you're a bad Marxist, doesn't mean you're a bad Marxist-Leninist. It means that you're doing exactly what you should be doing as a good empiricist, as a good Marxist-Leninist. So this is what really becomes, what characterizes Maoism is very different. Each one will have to take on local conditions for it to be a serious Maoism. And this is why Christophe Boursier has that famous quote in Les Maoistes, is Maoism has never existed, it does not exist, and that alone explains its success, is that there is no such thing as an orthodoxy. Nick Knight has gone on and on about saying that there's no such thing as an orthodoxy there, let alone an orthodox Marxism-Leninism. The pursuit of orthodoxy in that is an illusion. The importance is to see the ways in which people apply it. And just because they're adapting it and fitting it to their specific milieu does not mean they're abandoning the universality of this theory. And that, I think, is the core pillar of Mao Zedong thought, and indeed the core pillar of global Maoism.
I guess the next logical question for some people, I guess, would be, well, is that still, and I guess we're going to use the general word. I mean, yeah, you said sort of what Maoism could we say before, but I guess I'm going to step in it again and say, just let's use the word communism generally. Do you see sort of Lenin sort of building on Marxist theories, and then sort of Stalin building on Leninism, and perhaps building on is not even the right phrase there, but sort of, I guess this ties into my next question as well. Almost like a new prophet coming to the pulpit and saying, "Look, you know what? I've got some new ideas. Here's my version of things." And do you see Maoism really just as that next sort of version of that? And in that case, then is it still all the same thing, but just in different sort of shapes and sizes?
I'd certainly say so. And this is again just kind of seeing its lasting imprint, right? We still have a Maoist government in Nepal, right? So it has an afterlife, for sure. One of my favorite propaganda posters from China has the heads of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao, and it says Marxia Lenin, Zhuyi, Mao Zedong, Sisiang Wansui. So long live Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought. And the whole idea is that, again, the next evolutionary step of Marxism and Marxism-Leninism is Mao Zedong thought. And then you see how that appears in different iterations, right? In Nepal, it's Marxism-Leninism Prachanda path during the Prachanda years atop the Communist Party of Nepal, Marxist-Leninist. And in the Movimiento Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path movement in Peru, Abimel Guzman, who died a few years ago in prison, but he, as Presidente Gonzalo, promoted Gonzaloismo, the fourth sword, the cuarta espada of Marxism-Leninism. This whole idea that he's now the next after Mao. It's Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao. Oh, there I am. Because I think he may have even omitted Stalin in that. It might have just been Marx, Lenin, Mao, and him. Hence the cuarta. I think that's like certainly an aspect of is forged in the crucible of the Chinese Revolution, as Mao would call part of the third world, allows it to be kind of a way of interpreting the world and interpreting Marx and Lenin through the quote unquote third world lens, right? And that's why it has such broad applicability. The Chinese revolutionary experience as a largely agrarian society, having a small industrial working class, but obviously always keeping the working class as the vanguard, just drawing in and expanding what constitutes working class. And not at any point ever in his writing saying the peasants must lead the revolution. No, he's saying we need to harness them. And this is consistent among all Maoist parties. They're always trying to find ways of adapting and interpreting their situation critically with a view towards addressing grievances through the mass line. And then, of course, surrounding the cities from the countryside, and then implementing these sweeping changes as Mao had done. So I think that it certainly explains why it is that next evolutionary step and why it has such staying power. And it's also why we don't have two Maoisms that look alike. Tim Cheek in his book, or at least the critical introduction to Mao, and his contribution to that volume, asked the question: is there more than one Mao? And I think that you could make the same case. And just as my book does, if there's more than one Mao, then it makes sense to say there's more than one Maoism. And indeed, in every single iteration of Maoism, you have differences. And even in places where they don't become Maoist, but they engage with Maoism, like with the PKI, the Communist Party of Indonesia. Maoism's part of their intellectual foment. They're very interested in what's going on in China, but they're beholden to never abandon the realities as they see them in Indonesia. That's why they Indonesianized Marxism-Leninism in the 1950s. So I think that that's one of the things that I think really needed to be driven home in for instance, Julia Lovell's Popular History, Maoism and Global History. And one thing that I try and do in my book is really kind of showcasing and putting front and center some central importance of creative adaptation in Maoism. And I think that's the feature that makes it Maoism, is emphasizing the importance of interpreting the situation around you as it is, and forming policy based on that creatively, never in a kind of orthodox sense.
It's so interesting. You mentioned the shining path before, and it's something, I mean, again, something I know almost nothing about, but I did just read one of your old papers on it. And I was struck by something that you sort of just touched on there, which is almost, it has the same characteristic of, and this is another thing I'm not an expert in, but how Buddhism sort of became a Western Buddhism, and you had, I believe, probably in the 60s and 70s, where people were sort of traveling to parts of India or wherever it may be and studying with a certain teacher, and then sort of bringing back that, like a seed almost, to plant it back in different parts of the globe. And the reason I chose Buddhism in that example is because I almost see it like these revolutionaries from around the world sort of went on a pilgrimage to meet Mao and to bring back and bring back this seed. And I believe the phrase you use in the paper is sort of they planted the seed in the Andes Mountains in Peru, and it grew, and it made it might not be the tree that some people thought it was going to be, but it did grow. And I think the case for Cambodia is extremely clear that it was exactly that. But it's something you mentioned before, which is sort of Pol Potism, which I think is a very interesting phrase, and I would love to touch on that. And I thought I could sort of tee you off for that discussion by talking about this theme that I think has come up a lot in our discussion here, which is these parallels between sort of, I guess we could just say, maybe if we're being fancy, we could say maybe the mimetic qualities of religious thought and expression, or we could just perhaps in a more simple way say religion, the similarities between religion and communism, and how these things are expressed. I'm a big fan of Alex Hinton's work on this, and Philip Short and Ian Harris, as you mentioned. This role of Theravada Buddhism in the Khmer Rouge communism, or perhaps this better word would be Pol Potism, because of the Theravada grammar and thought and sort of systems that the Khmer Rouge utilized to sort of spread this, in many ways, foreign implant into in Cambodian minds. So I guess that's sort of where I wanted to just kick this one off with what do you think about generally people pointing out the parallels between religious thinking and communist thinking, and were these in some ways sort of a replacement for one another, in that politics became a religion in this communist sense. And I guess also your thoughts on the Buddhist Khmer communism, and whether that was Pol Pot's sort of brand of Maoism, was this hybrid with this new locale.
Well, it's a great question. I'll start with that one, and then I'll kind of cycle back to conciliations of religion and Marxism, and by virtue of that, communism, because I think that that's a fascinating story there. I don't think that Pol Pot used Buddhism seriously in crafting the Pol Potism. I think Buddhism is a syntax. I think Buddhism is a vocabulary to recruit, to show the ways in which ideas from China that are not forged in the crucible of Theravada Buddhism can fit very neatly as a mortar between the bricks so to speak, with the Cambodian society and revolution. So you have it in their slogans. Henri Lacal has covered that in his little red book, Pol Pot's little red book, Sayings of Anka. I think that is where Buddhism figures into it. I think as much as I absolutely admire and love Ian Harris's work, I think he's stretching a little bit back to say that Buddhism is a major influence on the Khmer Rouge at this point. I think that they're all good Buddhists. They all take Buddhism seriously. But in terms of framing policy and ideology, it's very passe. There's a reason why they're turning on monks, right? The reason why they're recruiting them, using them to proselytize, maybe not the same degree as the Pathet Lao in Laos, but their vision is, I mean, partly influenced by Kang Sak, is actually get rid of Buddhism, to outlaw it and get rid of it. They're not at all interested in having it dictate policy, at least in my experiences. It is a useful rhetorical device. It is a useful way to speak Maoism to people and speak concepts that would otherwise be completely foreign and completely alien and unintelligible to people who only really can understand what you're saying to them by using a kind of a local language. And Buddhism is a very useful tool for that. I don't think it's the types of conciliation between Theravada Buddhism and Maoism, or between Theravada Buddhism and Marxism, ever happen at the senior leadership level to the degree that you see in leftist circles in Indonesia between Islam and Marxism, and Islam and communism with the PKI under Aidit, where Islam is actually like absolutely inseparable from the PKI. It's not passe at any point. I think they might be more passe than at one stage or another, but it is certainly part of that conversation, and indeed what really informs many of their interpretations of Marxism, and what allowed it to take off like a prairie fire there at different points in its history. And this kind of is a good segue to just kind of showing communism as a religion. I owe this to Pierre Brocheur, who was discussing this in his biography of Ho Chi Minh, and it just has resonated. This is another great reading my old MA supervisor, Micheline Lessard, introduced to me, and she's like, it makes perfect sense, right? Mastery of a holy scripture. You have this pantheon of gods, so to speak, at least people whose moral example you wish to follow, and behavioral norms that you want to practice in daily life. And I just took it one step further with my book. I didn't love it was my initial title, and then I wanted to backtrack on it because I thought the use of red was a little too cliche. But the subtitle of my book, The Emergence of Global Maoism, is China's Red Evangelism. And the reason I state this is I think that the CCP's approach was very much evangelistic, right? If you look at the Communist Party of Soviet Union as kind of like a Catholic church or an Orthodox church trying to establish bureaucratic centralism, and the ways that the Bolsheviks did communism or did Marxism as the norm that everyone should follow, while in the same breath telling countries in the quote-unquote third world to work with the bourgeois nationalists to get independence first, well, then the Chinese revolutionary experience and Mao Zedong thought becomes a liberation theology, one that emphasizes going to the grassroots, alleviating poverty, listening earnestly to people's grievances, and then interpreting and forming kind of response to that accordingly. And the way that the party then says we need to export it in the 60s, that becomes very evangelistic. Having people coming to China on these trips, as you mentioned, Pol Pot 65, 66, Hu Nim just a year after that, is the personal witness, going there in the evangelical sense, seeing and having that awakening moment. Like I use the example in my book of Hong Shou Tran and the Taiping Vision, right? He reads this hellfire and brimstone Protestant tract, doesn't think much of it, goes to sleep, has a dream where he's Jesus's brother and God's Chinese son, wakes up, Taiping Kingdom. Like there's the revolution there to establish the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And it's the same thing here. Is you have the personal witness, you have the Holy Scripture, Mao's writings, whether in little red book form or otherwise, and then you have the goal of trying to go out and proselytize and spread the revolution globally, spread the religion globally. Right. So I think that's where I would say that there is not so much disunity between these things. And indeed, there may never have been disunity between these things, even as far back as looking at the Soviet Union and the Orthodox Church. Right. It's Mao never shook Confucianism. He never shook the influences that were on him. And I think that the Khmer Rouge obviously aren't framing policy around Buddhism, but they're certainly using it. They're certainly finding it a very useful rhetorical device and a useful way to draw people into a party. And this, just a small sidebar, this is a big part of the Leninist phenomenon as Kenneth Jowett explores in his book, A New World Disorder. that you have a party that's largely intellectual, largely urban based, or at least has spent a significant time in urban centers, that is trying to pitch a revolutionary, like a completely sweeping social and socioeconomic revolution or changing of their world. You've got to pitch that to people who are very much kind of rooted or steeped in status classificatory norms, things that matter at the local level. How do you do that? How do you sell a high modernist vision to people who, again, don't know what dialectical materialism is? And you have to do that by speaking in a language that they can understand. And for the Khmer Rouge, that's Buddhism. The Khmer Rouge, that's the royal family of Cambodia when Sihanouk joins and lends support to them. And it's to using the public face of these intellectuals, the three ghosts, who have devoted 10 plus years of their lives at certain points to the peasant cause, to alleviating their poverty and improving their standard of living. And I think that is how the Khmer Rouge uses Buddhism and is religious in that text. Now, one last thing, and I know I'm kind of rambling on here, but a picture in my book is the Pol Pot bus that are now, you can see them in the Tuol Sleng S21 prison. That is an effort by the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot regime, as Kieran's called it, to try and harness the power of the Cultural Revolution in a faith sense, the faith Maoism, where it's high on faith, a little bit low on theory, and use it to kind of establish that cult of personality that surrounds Mao at this time. And that is an effort to turn the faith into one of the party. The party always is doing this. They're the Anka. The Anka is the faceless organization, now with a face with the three ghosts. The Anka is your family. The Anka loves you. The Anka is going to do this and do that. Shirk off the old society of pre-revolutionary Cambodia. The Anka will direct you now on and embrace you wholly. And then once you have people believing in that, and they're willing to kind of let go of some norms at that level and embrace the high modernist vision, you can then pivot towards, well, here's our religious figure who's going to lead us to glorious utopia. And those busts are a material manifestation of that kind of pseudo-religious character of the Khmer Rouge.
I think it makes so much sense to use that to sort of explain one of the key questions that people have about the Khmer Rouge history, and that people will always come up with, which is, why did they do this? Why did they kill so many people? And I think for so many of us, however many years away from this will be, or however different the culture we might come from is, if someone was to say to you, "Oh, that person's an unbeliever," then you sort of start to get the connotation of what it might be like to say. You don't even have to be religious to sort of understand what that can mean in context. And you might have images of people being burnt at the stake or whatever it may be. And then when you're talking about this in this Pol Pot regime sense, where they weren't saying an unbeliever, but they might as well have been when they were saying that someone is a counter-revolutionary or a spy, or I think even when we use the phrase like Cambodian bodies with Vietnamese minds, where I believe it's someone like Steve Hedder would say, well, that might not even need to be taken so literally as this racial attack, but more as like well, the Vietnamese don't have the right political belief. They don't have the right communism. They're unbelievers, just like some other heathen would be. And of course, there's about 500 years of racial enmity that needs to get put into that context as well. But Matt, I'm becoming increasingly aware of the limits of sort of the human bladder, and I think that might actually be the perfect way to end this discussion. I've had an absolutely great time talking to you, mate. I would love to get you on again if when your book is out, and we can just get into that even more, because it's a real pleasure to speak to you, mate. You're such a fountain of knowledge on this. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I guess I wanted to just hand back to you for a second and say, this will be going out soon. Is there anything that you wanted to sort of, you've got a few books out, you've got a book upcoming. Is there anything that listeners should be aware of, or somewhere that they can find you to know more?
Well, thank you so much again for having me on, Lachlan. I had an absolute blast. Obviously, as listeners, and you can tell, I have no shortage of things to say about this, and sometimes I can blather on a bit, but you can find me. I've got a couple of pages up through the Australian National University, which is where I work here in Canberra. You can find The Emergence of Global Maoism through Cornell University Press. That should be easy to find on the website. You can download for free, open access, experiences or experiments with Marxism-Leninism in Cold War Southeast Asia through the ANU Press. It's available online if anyone wants to check out some of the work that I'm doing and some of my fellow travelers are writing about in terms of engagements with Marxism, Leninism, communism in Southeast Asia. Really, really fun stuff, really, really innovative scholarship there. The forthcoming book is tentatively titled Agents of Maoism, and it's a look at locally recruited Chinese communist spies, also looking at overseas Chinese in Cambodia, something that is sorely underrepresented in scholarship on just overseas Chinese and in Cambodian history, for that matter. So keep an eye out for that, hopefully in the next few years. Otherwise, if anyone's interested in publishing on Asia-related topics, I'm co-editor-in-chief of Asian Ethnicity, which is a really good Q1 journal that looks at kind of various very dimensions and problematics of ethnicity in the region. I'm pretty much all over podcasts and news outlets whenever anybody wants to talk about China and Cambodia. So hit any of those up if you're remotely interested in either of them. And if anybody wants to again explore Maoism outside of Asia, I've written a fair bit on the Shining Path and Nepal, which is all of those are available open access as well.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, mate. And I'll talk to you again.